All right, thank you, Mike. Marshall, yes, please. Daryl, thank you for spending time with Marshall and me discussing the important matter of messiness in market development this afternoon. I guess depending a bit on where you are. As Mike started to explain, the background for this is that between January 17 and June 2018, so over the course of 1.5 years, Marshall and I set out on an endeavor to write on what makes market development more messy, less linear, maybe sometimes less light touch than the theory suggests. And that resulted in 4 papers and 200 pages of text in total. The message of these papers is not that we say, well, we think it's time for something else than market systems development. In a sense, on the contrary, we do think that it's very important that the principles that underpin the market systems development approach, they are probably as relevant as ever. But when it comes to interpreting what those principles mean in different contexts, I think it's important to become more nuanced. There is no single best way of doing MSD. What is the best way of doing MSD is dictated by the context in which we need to operate. And the drive to start thinking about this a bit more came from my experience when I started the market development facility in Fiji in 2011. My background was that I had worked in Bangladesh on the Catalyst program, and pretty soon it became very clear that the kind of MSD I was used to do in that Bangladeshi or Asian context just wouldn't bring us absolutely nowhere in the Pacific. A very brief example, one of the first potential partners we interacted with was a chocolate maker. We knew that farmers were struggling to sell cocoa beans. We knew there would be a market for Fijian chocolate, selling that to tourists. We had a guy who could make chocolate. What we didn't need was a bit of light touch TA to somehow analyze the scenario. What we actually needed was a factory to make chocolate. And hence that sort of made us think about, how do we operate here? At some point in time, there was a peer learning event in which also team leaders spoke about the future of MSD or the lessons learned to date. And while everyone sort of acknowledged the importance of looking more at context to nuance a bit what we mean by good MSD, we also discovered that basically no one had really written about it. And hence, Marshall and I got together to start writing these papers, basically to find a way to show how MSD will be influenced by the kind of context that we are working in. So which papers did we write? Well, first we wrote 3 papers using 3 different tools to show the importance of context. In other words, just making the case that market development is more messy, is less linear, is sometimes less light touch than people suggest. Then we discovered we also had to write a 4th paper. Because even if we acknowledge the presence of messiness and the importance hence of analyzing context and responding to context, that knowledge in itself is not very useful if we don't have the organization that actually can do the responding. And hence we wrote another paper on what it means to be an agile learning organization that truly is able to adapt to the kind of scenarios that a particular economy sort of throws at us. There's also one paper that we didn't feel the need to write that has to do with quality management, or in other words, analyzing whether we are achieving results in those messy, sometimes unclear and conflicting scenarios. Because ultimately we do feel that the DCD standard is the right tool to sort of to get on top of those questions. Together, this acknowledgement of having to work in a more sort of context-informed manner through an organization that is truly able to respond to that context and sort of building on a strong results measurement system that really is compliant with VCT, we do think we have the key building blocks to basically work in most scenarios in which MSD could be active. Marshall, could you flip the slide?
Yes.
On the second slide, I don't need to say that much. I already explained the rationale for developing these papers. It's probably only worthwhile explaining why we chose MDF as a case. Well, basically, MDF allows us to compare two portfolios in two countries with virtually all other key elements that influence mutation being equal. MDF was implemented under one donor, one managing contractor, one management team, but as Mike started to suggest, operating in very, very different contexts. And hence we decided to compare horticulture in Pakistan with horticulture in Fiji, and then using a couple of tools to show how that implementation experience is different despite being part of the same organization. Over to you, Marshall.
Great. Well, thank you, Harald. And it's nice to connect with everybody and to give this opportunity to present our main findings, which we'll do so in a very pithy and short way, which is, but all of this can be covered by visiting the MDF website and to look under its publications, where you'll see all 4 publications. So the sort of the central argument is about that flexibility, that is the ability to adjust your interventions and your actions according to context. It's not a matter of just anything goes. It wouldn't be an MSD strategy any longer. Or that, you know, as Harald mentioned, that an approach that you might take in a more dynamic, thicker market with more system players should be contained by core principles, and I'll go through those briefly in a moment. And you know, and we wanted to make the point that this flexibility contained by core principles is essential for an MSD approach that can be more, not less, accountable for achieving pro-poor outcomes. And I think that was an important discovery, I think, in MDF over time, is that without the flexibility, and when practitioners take perhaps more of an approach that complies with sort of a more orthodox way of doing things, like light touch and TA and stand back and wait for things to happen, just wasn't going to work in all contexts. So we felt that when you could see that these principles are being applied in whatever context you may be in, then the implementer is more likely actually taking an MSD approach. And so the principles to which I think are kind of well known in the field, and certainly which guided MDF in phase 1, and I'm sure will continue to guide it in the next phase of operations, is it starts with selecting partners with a shared vision of inclusive growth. And of course, this is, you may, I'm sure, for those of you who are out there, you may speak to 15 or 20 firms and may find 1 or 2 that actually meet this criteria. But it really starts with that, is who you work with and what their vision of change is. And once you get to know the partners better, where they're coming from, what their future vision may be for their business, not just their own business, but how they contribute to the growth of the sector in which they are participants, then it's important to build on a partner's agenda, using local ideas and their solutions, versus which maybe in other approaches we tend to think that we have the solutions for the problem, and therefore we're looking for ways of kind of applying past solutions in a new context, which oftentimes is a formula for disaster. But in order to build on an agenda, we have to make sure there's a support for clear, that our support is in the context of a transaction. There is clear mutual commitments of time and resources by both parties. And those resources are used, particularly the facilitator's resources, are used to strengthen the partner's incentives and the capacity for success. And as you all know, sometimes we only really get to truly understand what a partner's incentives are, or when their business models meet the test of putting them into practice. Do they remain incentivized to do so, or do they begin to shift their interest elsewhere? And that certainly is a question we will have seen in the MDF portfolio. Again, we have to be flexible. Markets are messy. Markets are dynamic. They change. And so we have to be flexible in our ability to respond to that change process. So log frames are notoriously lousy instruments for guiding strategy and interventions, because the context will always change. But the most important principle for a facilitator, I think, is this continuous learning, so that you can learn, adapt, and change, and always in a search for whatever change is made is in the context of trying to achieve greater inclusive growth at scale. And for those of you who have been working in market systems, and market systems in our case, is you may be successful in, let's say, for example, linking chocolate farmers or cocoa farmers to better markets. But once you solve that problem, of course, you've created 2 or 3 new problems, whether it's quality or pricing or certification or better groups. And so as we engage in one part of the system, we always are not necessarily exiting the system, but we're exiting a piece of that system, so that there are other levers in that system that MSD practitioners could address in order to bring about wider change. And that continues, again, whether you start with farmers or private companies, you may move to government partners, you may move to media, and so on and so forth. But this cycle is really, and presents it one in sequence, more or less the context in which, or the principles that will guide facilitators' actions. So I'm going to turn this over to Harald to look at the next slide. How do we find this sweet spot for MSD programs?
Indeed. Thanks, Marshall. Yeah, so
Harald, just before you start, did you want to pause for questions at this point, or am I?
Oh, this would be a good moment, yeah.
Because one question which you may be able to speak to has just come through, which is about the DC standard as you mentioned the DC standard as an important control mechanism, quality control mechanism for this process. But Marshall also talked about the intrinsic difficulty of applying sort of rigid log frames to the process that he described. And I suppose there's the question then is, so how did you use the DC standard as a quality control mechanism, given this flexibility and the constant sort of shifting of the goalposts in a way within the specific intervention?
Yeah, thanks. That's indeed a good question. Obviously, the kind of theories of change or results change that you use as part of implementing a DCD standard are quite different from the log frame tool that preceded it. Both, of course, talk about a certain a hierarchy of objectives, but theories of change for under a DCD standard are typically built in relation to a particular partnership and or in relation to a particular sector in which you're active, and are expected to be updated as the scenarios of that partnership or sector change. In a sense, it comes down to the following. Regardless of the the complex or messy nature of the market you work in, you need to work with a kind of a theory of change. You need to know what your plan is and how you assume particular investments here lead to certain changes there, and then influence maybe more changes higher up the chain. So the fact that you work in messy environments actually makes a strong case to build theories of change, rather than sort of saying, well, because it changes too often, we're better off just not making them anymore. So challenging circumstances, you need a tool that manages you, and I think ultimately a results chain is a great way of doing that. But yes, you need to accept the fact that the messier the context, the more often you need to acknowledge that your initial theory of change is wrong, something was missing, and hence you need to update.
I would just add to that, Mike, that the underneath the changes that a results chain is trying to map out are the behavioral the shifts that go behind it, and so we're always looking at both the conditions that have changed, but also the reasons those have changed, whether it's moving from sort of a business culture that is very much a win-lose to one that is more win-win. So there are, again, we talked about incentives of the players, and that's always going to be something that is something to be very, very important to understand. The incentives to bring about really attitudinal behavioral shifts, so with markets and the pathway towards inclusive growth can really be inclusive of disadvantaged groups, poor people, women, young people, and so on and so forth. Okay.
Thank you. Great answer.
Any other? Should we move on?
Please, yes, do.
So, Harald, over to you.
Yeah, the sweet spot. Can you show the whole slide, Marshall? I think that's
the whole slide. Yes.
Yeah, that's.
How about here?
Okay, I can start there. So we need to talk about the sweet spot. Basically, we're trying to make an argument that there's no one-size-fits-all for MSD. That needs to be somewhat more tailored. And the starting point to explain what that means is indeed this continuum that you see here on the slide thus far. The two brown boxes on the right, the orthodoxy, and on the left, anything goes. Orthodoxy stands for maybe the common interpretation of MSD, maybe I should say the common sometimes misunderstanding of how people interpret what MSD is. In other words, the strong emphasis on being very light touch, very short duration, and God forbid if you do anything else, then provide technical assistance. What we try to say, as I tried to say, referring to Fiji, that orthodox interpretation certainly works in some countries and in some sectors, but probably not in many others. So what do we do then? Do we then throw principles and practices out the window and resort to an anything goes? No, that would of course absolutely be throwing literally the baby away with the bath water. So when we talk then about sort of defining that sweet spot, how do we find our space in between those two extremes, we really talk about 4 different elements that need to be aligned. First element has to do with markets. As we will say more often in this presentation, there's a clear distinction between operating in more mature markets and operating in thinner markets. More mature markets means more players, maybe more sophisticated players, more specialized support services, which means that the kind of innovation that we want to drive maybe can come mostly from within the system, and the kind of nudging that a facilitator needs to do may be truly somewhat light touch. In thin markets, it's truly a very different scenario. Few players, less sophistication, less specialization, bigger systemic gaps that need to be filled, and hence obviously literally a different ball game for facilities to deal with. The partner contact builds on this. obviously it's different to work with partners who are relatively established, have invented the wheel of doing their business, and need small tweaks to somehow become more inclusive and service a different market. That's quite different from working with other players, maybe younger, maybe smaller, maybe still in the midst of working out what their business really is about. Those kind of players literally just need more hand-holding, maybe more complex partnerships, and more informal advice by a facilitator on the sideline to make sure that that business sort of finds its way forward. That, of course, again, has an implication on the kind of partnership deals that you see. Yes, you sometimes can develop partnership deals that are very short, very light, TA only, and hence follow the classical example. Sometimes in different markets or maybe with different partners, you can end up in quite complex multi-step investment plans that are really necessary, because if you would only try to focus on one piece of that plan, you would never end up with a functional business plan that is truly commercially viable and truly can influence the kind of markets that you aim to be influencing. And even if you build a factory, and that's already quite ambitious in itself, if to make that factory run at sufficient capacity, you also need to look at sourcing networks, and you need that marketing strategies. Then you need to look at the whole picture before a plan becomes viable. Now, that variety in plans, of course, also again has implication on the kind of teams that you field to support these endeavors. Yes, sometimes a few business advisors can manage a multitude of partnerships because, by and large, they can run themselves with a bit of TA. Sometimes you need large teams to work with a relatively small number of partners because those partnerships are maybe very transformative, very high risk, and just need a lot of care without, of course, turning that into spoon feeding to make sure they actually see they reach the light at the end of the tunnel. So based on the kind of context that we encounter, based on how those four factors play out, the sweet spot can either be something that can lean a bit more to the orthodox side, and then it looks familiar with kind of MSD that we have seen, or it can lean more towards the anything goes side, simply because the context requires us to do so. And hence, finding the sweet spot is that dynamic interpretation of what is needed. Over to you, Marshall.
Great. We're going to quickly get on to one of the dimensions of messiness. What do we mean by messiness? And we did so by really unpacking the horticulture portfolio in two countries. So we took an overall portfolio view, and I just want to introduce the listeners to the types of interventions or partners and the kinds of products and services that they were innovating in order to expand their businesses and be more inclusive at the same time. Certainly that was the nature of the shared vision between MDF and all the partners in horticulture and all the other sectors where MDF works. So all partners are strategically identified. There's a bunch of partners who focus more on the input pathway to business growth by helping, in this case, in Pakistan, a large foreign company who is diversifying into Pakistan to source HYV or high-yielding varieties onion seeds for their global network. Locally, they're vegetable seed and seedling producers. A large company was with ag inputs, first helped to identify a solution to a major disease in Pakistan, in the Punjab area of quinoa, which is a type of mandarin and a large sector, agricultural sector in the country. Also helping with looking at different biofertilizers. So you have ag inputs, and compared to that with the other part of that pathway would be more of access to market, trying to assist partners, diversify into a variety of domestic and export markets, either with sort of health-oriented, for consumers that are looking at better quality, better safety, aflatoxin-free chilies, which are turned into chili powder, trying to find linking producers of apricots in the borderland areas in Pakistan to both domestic markets for quality as well as more regional export markets for organic produce. Again, compare that to Fiji. Again, ag input bundles across a variety of ag inputs from seeds to root tissue culture for root crops. Also, agricultural lime, an interesting case that Harald that we will mention a little later on, of taking a building, manufactured building materials and using the lime deposits in their quarries to diversify into agricultural products. Again, also in Fiji, in many ways in Fiji, it's more cost-effective to serve Australia and other South Pacific islands than it is to serve consumers within Fiji itself and its many islands, logistic nightmares, high degree of cost, and so on. So, helping Fiji partners to really diversify into export markets across major root crops like kava and cassava to vegetables, spices, and oils. So these are the partners, and these are the nature of where the pathways in which MDF was strategically positioned those partners to demonstrate how these different pathways can contribute to broader system change that is inclusive. So one of the things that we discovered by looking at the portfolio was to see how they were positioned on their industrial life cycles, and this slide here, and let me just briefly go through the slide, for those unfamiliar with it. So this is a typical product life cycle or industry life cycle where an industry or a product goes through a sequence set of relatively predictable stages, starting at the introduction, where you're testing new ideas, and where there's very little support within the market system for that idea. But as it takes off, innovation is leading change, leading growth, and what comes around that innovation is an emerging support system, whether it be finance or whether it be specialized technical services. But as the business model begins to grow even more, there's more crowding in of other players who are now replicating that business model. And so at the mature stage of any industry, you'll see that innovation no longer leads, but its margins are thin. And so the winners are those who can achieve greater efficiencies. And of course, in this situation, you have a high degree of intensive support. And then eventually new innovation comes, support wanes, and the cycle starts over again. So where were the MDF portfolio partners in terms of the life cycle of the segments in which they were a part? And what we see, and I'll just put this all up here, is that we see here is that both in Pakistan and Fiji, there were opportunities in the nascent as well as the early stages of growth. These is when systems are messy because the norms haven't yet been established. The kinks and the teething problems of business models are being worked out. Oftentimes there may need to stimulate demand for a range of different types of products, and we see that whether it's in Pakistan or in Fiji, many of the business models were positioned in this stage of growth. And we also found that at the very opposite end, there are a lot of small holders who were in sectors of their market segments that were very much in their decline, they were being kept open by a high degree of government subsidy, often very political crops, whether it be cassava or whether it be basic food crops in Pakistan. And these would find these to be very hard areas for an MSD facilitator to kind of engage, largely because of the politics and the connections that needed to be kind of addressed, where an MSD facilitator really maybe has a hard time being able to bring about change there. However, in the stages of where you're mature and beginning to work towards that decline is how do you reposition smallholders into opportunities? And so the positioning, the relative positioning of overall MDF's horticulture portfolio in Pakistan showed that most opportunities for pro sector growth are found in market segments in the nascent or early growth phases of their Indian industry life cycle. And this is the stage of the cycle that is the most messy. So I'm going to turn it back to Harald. There may be a question here, and Mike, if there is, we can stop here. But if not, we would want to continue to move on to the next slide as another dimension that we looked at to help define the degree of messiness or the context that would guide MSD sort of strategies and actions.
Thank you, Marshall. There is one question that's come through, and I don't know how you're doing for time, Marshall.
We're not doing well on time. We have a few more slides to get through. So,
well, okay, maybe we'll park it to the end. Then why don't you crack on?
Why don't we do that?
Yeah, thanks.
Harald.
Yes. All right. The second tool. Yeah. So the first tool showed that when it comes to the sector life cycle, there's not much difference between mature markets and thinner markets. The opportunity for inclusive innovation is really the early stages, which are also the messy stages. The second tool, however, does show a difference, a clear difference between thin markets and more mature markets. What you see here in front of you is what is called the ends of a market matrix, which is used to, in a sense, map out business expansion strategies. You see on the horizontal axis products, you see on the vertical axis markets, and then there are the words new and existing everywhere, which creates 4 different quadrants. The bottom left quadrant is the quadrant that captures the relatively easy market expansion. You have a known product, say you're selling seeds, and you have a known market, you're selling that to farmers, and you just want to do more of that. Still maybe requires, ways of scaling up, but nonetheless is relatively straightforward. Here you see that Pakistan, the Pakistan portfolio is a little bit overrepresented compared to the Fiji portfolio. Maybe it's useful, Marshall, if you show all the percentage, yes?
Yeah.
Then you have 2 quadrants, so the top left one and the bottom right one, where the business expansion is somewhat more complicated. In the top left one, the business expansion is driven by selling existing products into new markets. So you have one known quantity, but also an unknown quantity. You are in the business of selling seeds, but now you need to figure out how to sell seeds to small farmers. That is a different ballgame. In the top right quadrant, it's the opposite scenario. The market is known, so you know maybe your farmer clientele, but you want to sell a new product to them. Then the top right quadrant is the most challenging quadrant, because here you are really talking about selling a new product into a new market. Now, if you sort of compare the relative presence of the Pakistan and Fiji portfolio in those 4 quadrants, you do see, as I mentioned, that Pakistan is somewhat overrepresented in the easy quadrant. Pakistan and Fiji sort of are comparable in the next level of complexity, the top left and the bottom right. But Fiji is really, really overrepresented in the top right quadrant. That has to do with the fact that you're dealing with thin markets. That means you want to make a market, you want to develop a market, but the player that is, say, best placed to drive that change is still relatively far removed from that market. So, for instance, in Fiji, we ended up working with a road building company to sell agricultural line to farmers. The road building company didn't know the product, agricultural line, and certainly didn't know the farmers to which it had to sell that new product. So that kind of scenario is really much more difficult than just doing more of the same. And the fact that you end up working in Fiji more with that kind of partnerships has to do with the fact that the system that you work in has many gaps, has very few players, and hence you need to be sometimes quite ambitious to find a way to make a market work better.
Great. So we're going to move on to another way we unpack the horticulture portfolio. And here we use another matrix. Many of you may be familiar with this matrix, and so we're using it courtesy of the Springfield Center. It's called the Will-Skill Matrix, and again, it's a 2x2 matrix, and it shows 4 possible quadrants of the bottom left, where a partner may have low will and low skill. Typically, we find in the case of this portfolio and other MDF programs where there's a high degree of incentive to change, but there's oftentimes lots of gaps in the capacity to implement that change. However, we also do find that there are oftentimes many big players, the most skilled and experienced companies in a particular context or in a particular sector, who have a high degree of skill, but they don't have necessarily a lot of will to change. After all, they're already benefiting quite a bit from the way the system is currently structured. And occasionally you might find people who have both a high will and a high skill, and this is relative to achieving inclusive growth as partners with MDF. So how does the portfolio stack up? Well, you'll see in Pakistan, a larger number of those 9 firms that we profiled are moving or leaning towards blocking their capacity, remaining highly motivated to continue on with their business models, whether it can be exports of Fijian vegetables to Australian markets. I'm sorry, that was Fiji. Whether it be Ali Akbar, serving small farmers, or whether it be a date company who is really very entrepreneurial and finding all kinds of new ways of processing and packaging dates for high-end markets, and largely employing a lot of women in the processing factory. We compare that with Fiji, and you'll see that the preponderance of partners, at least 10 of them, are more towards the left side, where they have varying degrees of skill and will and skill, and very underrepresented, really, in terms of their movement towards their ability to influence other players. So, in many ways, MDF and MSD programs seek to find partners who, because of their vision and because of their positioning within the system, are in the best position to influence system players to address obstacles of inclusive growth. And we will, in many cases, in the case of Pakistan, you have more partners who are moving in that direction. And so, again, what we found is that, in the case of certainly in both in Fiji as well as in Pakistan, those who are engaged in riskier business strategies, like in the case of Fiji, market diversification, are oftentimes implemented by relatively less skillful partners. And this will take by more facilitator resources to help move them and their products and services in a way that they can influence greater market system transformation. And so when we speak of resources, you can see here there's we took the structure of MDF partner offers and looked at it relative to more of light touch certification, a one-shot deal to help open up more markets or specialized training to fill a specific gap, let's say, within processing companies achieving HACCP certification, and short-term consultants, whether local or international, to solve particular problems, where when you see in terms of equipment as well as the factory that Harald mentioned, you'll see that in Fiji, the resources or the structure of MDF partners and the relative degree of resources and time is obviously higher in areas where the markets are thinner and the partners are somewhat weaker. And so so again, we can use that this will-skill matrix once again to define sort of the messy context in which MSD facilitators need to be aware and embrace in order to tailor their approaches to the context and the partners in which they're working. Harald, over to you.
All right. Yes, so more messages.
We have just 2 more slides and then we'll be done.
Yes. So more messiness in thin markets. How does that show? What does it mean for the life of a business facilitator? So on this slide, we have 2 cases. We compare a best case scenario from Pakistan with a more probably average case scenario from Fiji. Yeah, it's pretty useful if you can show them. Yeah. So the Pakistan scenario is as follows. What you see here is that the golden rule is no partnership ever goes to plan. You will always need to redraft your theory of change at least once. The real question is, how often do you need to redraft the theory of change? In the Pakistan scenario, so that's the top half of the slide, MDF is working with a partner on sourcing of seed onions. Something went wrong with, something happened. There was a flood. The sourcing base for seed onions was literally washed away. The partner had to rethink where to source the onion seeds from. MDF was monitoring the situation and was able to provide useful information on, well, there are other farmers higher up in the valley you can source some too, and hence there's an opportunity to diversify your sourcing model. In the Pakistan scenario, you see that a partner is more likely to be able to work with that kind of market intelligence, retool the business plan, and make it work again. And from there on, things start to get into a good shape. So that's an example of a relatively stronger partner where relatively light touch facilitation does the trick. Then you go to the bottom slide of the bottom part of the slide, where we see a far more bumpier Fijian scenario. This is the scenario to which I referred to earlier. This is the road building company that had access to lime, was interested in seeing if they could sell this lime as an agricultural product to farmers, but beyond that was very uninformed of what it meant. So there, MDF had to go through a sequence of interventions to step by step develop a business model that had sufficient scale to make the product interesting for that company, and of course to make sure that it had sufficiently deep development impact. So rather than sort of being there, providing advice, stepping back, and then it takes care of itself, basically this was a process of stepping out and stepping in a number of times to constantly work with a partner to fix the business model to ultimately get it to work in a way that it became truly sustainable. So this kind of being there longer, stepping in, stepping out, checking, is it working? No, something more is needed. What is that? How can we do it? That is part of I think the facilitation scenario in thin markets. And of course, that again is more resource intensive and requires ultimately from your teams more skills and more market intelligence to be able to give the right suggestions when something could get otherwise stuck.
Yes, in our papers we said gear up for messiness when you start unpacking the actual process of MDF implementation. And I think I just wanted to, we have one more slide, but we have actually two more slides. One is a wrap up of what the sweet spot looks like visually. And then we also wrote on a fourth paper on what does an agile learning organization look like. But Mike, we're kind of moving forward with our time. So could you give us a sense of should we wrap it up on the next slide and then take questions? And then if we have time move on to the last slide.
Yes, Marshall. I think you should probably wrap it up on the next slide because there are a couple of interesting questions, and it would be good to create some space for that.
Okay, great. So really, in summary, so we took that rather flat sort of continuum of that sort of our analytical framework, and when we finished, we started to plot what it might look like against those four dimensions of market context to the upper right, and the continuum on that context is from thinner to thicker markets. Then there's partner context from many to few, and then we had partnership deals, which had, as we've talked, can be very light in touch, depending on the context, and also a much more concentrated effort, both in terms of resources and time by the facilitator, and that is shown in the last dimension on the lower left corner, from less intensive time and resources to more. And so I just show you that in thinner markets, you can see that, of course, the thinner markets are thin, less transactions, and so on. I won't repeat everything we said. Consequently, the partner context is also, if you say, thin. And so you start seeing where that line is drawn in terms of partnerships. It does require a bit of a heavier touch. Referring back to the structure of the deal slide that we showed earlier. And as a result, there is more team and time to manage complexity and manage the process of messiness as new business models are trying to take root, and oftentimes of being in the hands of weaker partners. Compare that to thicker markets, where you can see more transactions, more support services. There are many more different types of firms, and not just firms, but also government or media or financial services. In other words, there's a wider range of partners who, once an innovation starts to take off, they begin to crowd in. And partnership deals tend to be have a heavier touch and more. Sorry, let me go back. And more team and time resources. So in a sense, the summary of our presentation is that where well, let me summarize it this way. The why, that is trying to stimulate inclusive growth, and the how, facilitating wider firm and system change, is always going to be more important than the what. The what is going to change, the strategies and or the actions that facilitators will use. And this is just an inherent part of trying to stimulate through market system development more inclusive and growth for growth. So I guess that summarizes it. So we're ready for questions. We'll leave that slide up there.
Great, yeah, thank you. Do leave it up there because great presentation, guys. And we've had a rush of questions actually in the last few minutes, so I won't be able to cover all of them. And for those of you who've asked questions that don't get addressed, please post them in the Beam forum. So we'll start a conversation thread in the Beam forum on LinkedIn, and hopefully we can keep Harald and Marshall engaged in response to your questions in that space. But right now, two people have asked a similar sort of question, guys, which is you talk about you're defining sort of axes for describing the context, the thickness or thinness of the market, and the partner context. A couple of people have asked, what about social institutions, for example, say specifically gender norms? I mean, does the sort of and also you could argue the political economy, but I mean, do these kind of institutional contexts, the social norms, the political economy, the level of gender dysfunction, if you like, how do they affect the sweet spot?
Right. Let me take a stab at that one. I guess when we think of market context, we show here one dimension, but obviously we haven't lost sight of the societal norms, the institutional norms that either accept or embrace or don't embrace inclusivity. Pakistan is a good case in terms of women norms, and we actually had a very good case of Harald mentioned the Onion, the company that was trying to promote high-yielding variety onion seeds. When the floods hit, they could no longer source from male farmers who had bigger plots of land closer to the roads, and because of MDF understood women economic empowerment issues, they were able to provide links to women in their kitchen gardens who were not the closest, but they could begin to work with them. And so because of the urgency of the company, their incentives to serve their market, they were ready to cut through institutional norms in order to satisfy their market. And so I think that's these terms. These are definitely not missed. We don't have a separate continuum in there, but one could also, besides the nature, the thick or thinness of the market, one could say the relative degree of bottlenecks of really trying to push an inclusive agenda of more disadvantaged people.
Yeah, if I quickly add to that, indeed, sort of, when we made this graph, we were quite happy that we were able to sort out these four key factors and sort of come up with a figure that maybe would speak to people. But of course, people are fully right in saying, well, beyond partner, markets, deal, and team and time, there are other dimensions that in a sense should be woven into this. Gender is obviously one of them. Where in MDF we start to work, we start to demand that every partnership would be informed by an appropriate women's economic empowerment framework, and that indeed sometimes requires that more work needs to be done with a partner, and obviously that means then that you need more things in your deal to make sure that the gender dimension is sufficiently covered off, which means hence you will end up doing a bit more than the ultra light touch
And if I could just add one little point, we showed we said that most opportunities for inclusive growth were found in the nascent and the early growth stages of a segment in an industry, and that's where the rules are still undefined. That's where traditional norms may not apply. This is where there's a lot more opportunity because the systems around those market segments aren't so already divided by politics or by traditional beliefs and norms. So it creates really more opportunities. One might think, well, but the scale is in cocoa and coffee and in other agricultural commodities. Yes, that's true, but at least from the MDF perspective, others will be able to talk about that. How difficult it is to change the conventional wisdom when there's already so much at stake by the relatively few players who dominate those larger systems, both political as well as and private.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We have unfortunately run out of time, but it's been a very rich conversation. It's been a fascinating webinar. I've really enjoyed it. I know lots of the people listening have from the comments I've been receiving. Please, let's take some of these questions onto the Beam forum. Isabel has just posted a link to the Beam Exchange forum in the chat box, so you can directly join there. And we've also posted a link to a quick online survey. It's really quick. It takes about 15 seconds. Please click on that link, cut and paste it now into your browser, and give us a little bit of feedback on what you thought about this webinar before you forget. It will take you literally no more than 10 or 15 seconds, and I'd be hugely grateful. But I am also, of course, hugely grateful to Harald and Marshall for a really fascinating webinar, and I look forward to continuing these conversations in the Beam forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And thanks to everyone who attended. And we'll post you lots of information, of course, about new webinars coming up in the new year. Other than that, have a great day.
Bye now.